So if I asked you to imagine the year 1700, and I told you to point to the most industrialized, heavily urbanized, just absolutely economically dominant powerhouse on the entire planet, where would you point?
Most people would probably guess somewhere in Europe, right?
Exactly. You'd think London, maybe Paris, Madrid, but you wouldn't look there. You would look at India.
Yeah, without a doubt.
And yet, it's weird, because usually when we talk about history's really great empires,
Yeah.
there's this expectation of, well, just this monumental simplicity.
Right, the postcard version of history.
Yes, exactly. We look at a postcard of the Taj Mahal, we see the gleaming white marble, that perfect symmetry, and your brain just points and says, there it is, wealthy kings building pretty things.
Which is such a comforting myth, isn't it?
It really is.
I mean, we like our history to be visible, easily categorized into these neat little aesthetic boxes of absolute monarchs and unimaginable fairy tale riches. But when you look at the raw data, the reality of the empire that ruled the Indian subcontinent for centuries is, frankly, infinitely more complex and much more impressive than just a collection of palaces.
Oh, absolutely. And that is exactly why today on the Deep Dive, we are tearing down that postcard myth. We are immersing ourselves in a really dense, highly detailed compilation of historical, economic, and demographic records sourced from Wikipedia.
And this covers a huge span of time, right?
Right, covering the entirety of the Mughal Empire from its founding in 1526 all the way to its final gasp in 1857. And to give you, the listener, a sense of the mind-bending scale we're dealing with right out of the gate here, at its absolute peak, this single empire produced roughly 25% of the world's industrial output.
I really want to pause on that. A full quarter of the globe's manufacturing.
A quarter. It's insane.
It is. And if that isn't staggering enough, the records indicate that during this period, their urbanization rate, meaning the sheer percentage of the population living in cities rather than rural agrarian settings, is actually higher than contemporary Europe.
Let that sink in for a second. A higher urbanization rate than Europe.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to extract the most surprising, vital nuggets of insight from these records. We're going to explore how a nomadic lineage of warriors managed to build a proto-industrial superpower.
And how they managed the immense wealth that followed.
Exactly. And then, crucially, why that massive world-dominating engine ultimately stalled and just collapsed in on itself. Okay, let's unpack this by starting at the very beginning.
Makes sense.
And looking at these sources, the roots of this empire are incredibly martial and, frankly, a bit confusing right off the bat, starting with the name itself.
The name is a huge misconception.
Yeah, because the whole world knows them as the Mughals.
Oh, yeah.
But according to the source we have, that's almost a historical typo.
It's a fascinating quirk of history, honestly. Mughal, or, sometimes spelled Mogul or Mughal, is actually an Indo-Persian and later Western adaptation of the word Mongol. But the irony here is that the early founders and followers of the dynasty weren't technically Mongols at all, at least not in the strict sense.
Wait, really? What were they?
They were Chagatai Turks.
So Mughal was basically a label slapped onto them by outsiders.
Very much so. It was a term applied to them by the local populations in India, almost by association, right? The locals needed a way to distinguish these new invaders from the Afghan elite who were already ruling the Delhi Sultanate at the time.
Okay, that makes sense.
So Mughal just became a colloquial catch-all for these northern conquerors. But if you were to, say, walk into the imperial court and ask the early emperors what they called themselves, the actual official designation for their dynasty was Gurkhani.
Gurkhani. And the text says that translates to son-in-law, which is, that's a very specific, almost strange thing to name your entire dynasty. Why son-in-law?
Well, it's a direct reference to their descent from the Turco-Mongol conqueror Timur.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, Timur took the title Gurkhani son-in-law after he married a Chinggisid princess, meaning a direct descendant of Genghis Khan.
I see.
So the founder of the Mughal Empire, a man named Babur, carried this incredible dual legacy. Paternally, Babur descended from Timur, and maternally, he descended from Genghis Khan.
Talk about a heavy-hitting genetic resume. You've got two of the most devastating, formidable conquerors in human history in your immediate family tree.
There's definitely a psychological weight to that.
For sure. Babur isn't just some warlord. He views himself as the heir to a massive continental legacy. And according to the records, he's originally from what is now Uzbekistan, right? He doesn't start in India.
No, he doesn't. And his early life is actually marked by failure, interestingly enough.
Really?
Yeah, he was ousted from his ancestral domains in Central Asia. He tried repeatedly to hold the city of Samarkand and just kept losing it.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
So he's essentially a king without a kingdom for a while.
Exactly. So, forced out of his homeland, he establishes himself in Kabul, in modern-day Afghanistan, and then begins to look steadily southward, pushing into India through the Khyber Pass.
And this brings us to the pivotal moment that changes world history in 1526, right?
Yep.
The First Battle of Panipat.
Yes, 1526.
Now, reading through the mechanics of this battle is where the story shifts from a regional conflict to a full-blown military revolution.
Oh, absolutely.
Babur is facing Ibrahim Lodi, who is the Sultan of Delhi. And Babur is at a severe numerical disadvantage. I mean, Lodi has a massive army, including literal war elephants.
War elephants were the tanks of the era.
Right. But Babur has a catalyst that completely rewrites the rules of engagement on the subcontinent.
Gunpowder. And it's vital to understand the mechanics here because historians classify the Mughals alongside the Ottomans and the Safavids in Persia as an Islamic gunpowder empire.
Okay.
But the text makes a critical distinction. It wasn't just the mere possession of primitive firearms that won the day at Panipat. It was the tactical deployment of those weapons.
All right, because I'm looking at the notes on Babur's preparations,
No.
and he doesn't just hand his men guns and tell them to shoot.
No, not at all.
He actually employs an Ottoman expert, a master artillerist named Ustad Ali Quali. And this guy brings in what was essentially the bleeding-edge military tech and strategy of the 16th century.
Absolute cutting edge.
Walk me through how this actually looked on the dusty plains of Panipat.
Okay, so Ustad Ali Quali implemented a standard Ottoman formation that the Indian subcontinent had never seen before. Imagine a massive open battlefield.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
In the very center of Babur's line, he doesn't just have infantry standing there exposed. He places his artillery and his matchlock-equipped infantry behind a physical barricade of wagons that are literally tied together.
So it's like a mobile fortress.
A literal wall of wood and iron that breaks the momentum of a frontal charge.
Wow.
So the infantry can fire their matchlocks from behind the safety of these wagons, but that's only the center. On both the left and right wings of this wagon fortress, Babur positions his highly mobile, heavily trained mounted archers.
So it's like bringing modern artillery and entrenched infantry to a medieval jousting match.
That's a great way to put it.
I mean, you have the Afghan and Rajput forces loyal to the Delhi Sultanate charging forward, relying on sheer numbers and the terror of war elephants. But against disciplined, continuous fire from matchlocks, field artillery booming from behind a wall of wagons, and cavalry constantly flanking and harassing them.
The traditional Indian armies were just shattered.
Yeah.
And the psychological impact of the field artillery alone cannot be overstated. The noise, the smoke, the sheer concussive force, it terrified the war elephants, causing them to trample their own troops.
That's horrifying, but brilliant tactically.
It was. That decisive victory at Panipat is a major reason why, for the rest of the empire's history, opponents rarely chose to meet Mughal armies in pitched, open-field battles.
They just knew they'd lose.
The tactical advantage of this integrated gunpowder and cavalry system was just too overwhelming.
And what blows my mind is that they didn't just invent this system and then rest on their laurels. The records show continuous military innovation.
Yeah, they were constantly tinkering.
Yeah, for instance, when I read the note about them using metal cylinder rockets in the 1500s under Babur's grandson Akbar, I honestly had to double-check the source.
It sounds like sci-fi, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
I know we aren't talking of the Apollo program here, but walk me through the physics of a 16th century battlefield rocket. How does that even work?
So these were known as bands. They were essentially iron tubes packed with tightly rammed gunpowder attached to long guiding sticks.
Okay, so kind of like a very large, incredibly dangerous modern firework.
Exactly. The innovation was the iron casing, which allowed for a much higher pressure buildup before the exhaust escaped, giving the rocket significant range and speed.
And the target for these rockets?
War elephants, primarily.
Oh, of course.
Again, the psychological warfare aspect is key here. Imagine the sheer chaos of a burning, shrieking metal cylinder rocket skipping erratically across the ground and exploding in the middle of a stampeding elephant charge.
That would create absolute mass panic.
Precisely. It was designed to create panic in the enemy's heaviest shot cavalry.
And the innovations kept coming. The text mentions a Persian polymath working for Akbar named Fadullah Shirazi. This guy develops an early multi-barrel volley gun.
Yes. A really incredible piece of engineering.
It fired multiple hand cannons loaded with gunpowder in rapid succession. I mean, we are talking about a 16th century precursor to the Gatling gun.
It was.
That is terrifying, and it's brilliant. But here is the thing that really trips me up, and I want to push back on this whole narrative of military supremacy.
Sure.
You have this lineage of nomadic conquerors. Their entire cultural DNA, inherited from Timur and Genghis Khan, is built on highly mobile, devastating, hit-and-run warfare.
Right.
If they were so inherently nomadic and martial, how did they build a stable government? We see it all the time in history. A brilliant warlord sweeps across a continent, dies, and the whole thing fragments because they only knew how to pillage, not how to govern. How did the Mughals avoid that trap?
That is the essential paradox of the early Mughal period, and it's a fantastic question.
Because it just seems totally counterintuitive.
It does. Military might is what wins you the territory, right? It shatters the previous regime, but you cannot shoot a cannon at a tax deficit.
No, you really can't.
It takes an entirely different skill set. It takes meticulous bureaucracy to actually hold a territory, administer justice, and extract economic value from it.
Right.
And you are right to be skeptical because that administrative genius did not fully materialize under Babur.
Yeah.
It took a few generations. The true bureaucratic machine was built by the third emperor, Akbar.
So Akbar inherits this vast conquered territory, and he realizes he can't just run it from the saddle. He has to turn it into a machine.
A highly centralized, deeply organized machine. Akbar instituted a government structure at the very top that relied on 4 main ministries, all reporting directly to the emperor.
Okay, let's break those down.
First, you had the Duodhan, who was the finance and revenue minister. And given the importance of taxes, this person often acted as the de facto prime minister.
The guy holding the purse strings always has the power.
Always. Then you had the Mir Bakshi. This is a fascinating role because the Mir Bakshi handled the military payroll and logistics, but they were also in charge of intelligence gathering.
Oh, I love that those two functions are combined.
It's very smart.
The person responsible for paying the massive imperial army is the exact same person running the network of spies and informants across the empire.
Yeah.
It's incredibly pragmatic. If you know where the threats are, you know exactly where to allocate the troops.
Exactly. It creates a very tight loop of information and military response. The third ministry was the Sadr Asudr, who was responsible for the legal system, appointing judges, and managing religious patronage and charitable grants.
So law and religion.
Right. And finally, you had the Mir Saman, who managed the imperial household, the state workshops, and massive public works projects.
Okay, so that's the federal level, so to speak.
Yeah.
But to manage an entire subcontinent, you have to break it down further. And the records detail how they carved the empire up into administrative divisions. You have the Subas, which are the major provinces, each headed by a governor.
Correct.
Underneath the Subas are the Sarkars, which are like districts. And beneath those are the Parganas, which were smaller clusters of villages.
And here is a crucial detail from the records that highlights their administrative flexibility. These divisions were not static. The Mughals didn't just draw a rigid line on a map and leave it there for 300 years. Territories were fluidly rearranged.
How so?
Well, a Sarkar could be upgraded to a full Suba, or its borders could be shifted entirely.
But why? If you have a map, why keep changing the borders?
Because they weren't organized based on strict geography or historical tribal boundaries.
Yeah.
They were organized based on land revenue capacity.
It always comes back to the money.
Always. The Mughals didn't have the resources for satellite mapping, right? They relied on highly detailed, localized statistical records of what the land could physically produce.
It's almost like modern municipal zoning laws, but dictated entirely by agricultural output.
That's a great comparison.
If an area suddenly gets a new irrigation canal and starts producing 3 times as much grain, the empire basically rezones it for tighter administrative control and more efficient tax collection.
That's exactly how it functioned. And that brings us to the absolute bedrock of Mughal wealth, the engine that made all of this bureaucracy possible, the Zabit system.
The Zabit system. Now, looking at the sources, this is the monetary tax system that Akbar introduced.
Yes.
But to make a massive empire-wide cash tax system work, you can't have people paying with 50 different types of local coins or like bags and rice. You need a reliable standardized currency. Enter the silver rupee.
The Mughals adopted and completely standardized the rupee, and their commitment to the integrity of this currency was nothing short of staggering. For over a century, they minted these silver coins with a guaranteed purity that never dropped below 96%.
96%. That's incredible. No debasement, no clipping the coins to save money. Just 96% pure silver, globally recognized and trusted.
It was the dollar of its day.
And by introducing this pure currency, Akbar fundamentally changes how the economy works. In the old-school tribute system, a local lord just hands over a percentage of his wheat or his barley to the king's men. But Akbar replaces that with a cash tax system. He essentially forces the entire peasantry into the market economy.
I want to break down why that is so brilliant.
Please do.
If you are a peasant farmer in a small pargana and suddenly your taxes are due in pure silver rupees instead of sacks of grain, you can't just barter your surplus grain with your immediate neighbor anymore.
Right, because your neighbor doesn't have silver either.
Exactly. You have to travel, you have to take your goods to a larger regional market, find a merchant who has silver currency, and sell your goods to them.
It forces movement. It forces trade.
Yes. This wasn't just a method of taxation, it was a state-sponsored incentive program to monetize the entire rural economy. And it goes deeper than that because the revenue system was heavily biased in favor of high-value cash crops.
Right, because if you owe the tax collector 10 silver rupees, you can try to grow enough subsistence barley to sell for 10 rupees, which might take a massive amount of land and labor.
Right.
Or you can grow cotton, or indigo, or sugarcane, or opium.
Precisely. I mean, that is the core mechanism. The state is actively encouraging the cultivation of commodities that have massive domestic and international demand.
They're engineering the agricultural sector to produce exports.
If you grow indigo, you get your silver faster.
It is a breathtakingly modern approach to macroeconomic engineering.
Mm-hmm.
But as I'm reading this, there is a logistical reality that makes me laugh.
Oh, the capital city.
Yes. You have this highly centralized, deeply bureaucratic IRS-style tax system. They are calculating agricultural yields across millions of square miles, standardizing currency, moving goods to market. And yet, where is the capital city? Where is the central hub for all this? It's moving around in giant tents.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
I have to push back here. How do you run a centralized, data-driven state when your capital city is quite literally mobile?
What's fascinating here is the sheer, unbelievable scale of these mobile imperial camps. When we hear camp, we think of a few dozen tents for the king, his bodyguard, and maybe a cook.
Right, like a big camping trip.
But from Akbar's time onward, these imperial camps were cities. They were massive, sprawling metropolises made of canvas and timber. They were accompanied by armies of tens of thousands, laborers, artisans, merchants setting up mobile bazaars, and the entire bureaucratic apparatus.
The filing cabinets, the ledgers, the treasury boxes, the courts of law, it all just packs up onto elephants and camels and moves.
All of it. The administration and governance didn't pause when the emperor traveled. It was carried out continuously within these camps. They functioned as de facto capitals.
That is wild.
Now, the Mughals did have permanent, magnificent capital cities, Agra, Delhi, Lahore, Fatehpur Sikri, and the official seat of power shifted between them over the centuries based on political or military needs. But the emperor spent a massive portion of his reign physically on the move.
And why go through that logistical nightmare? Just show up.
It was about presence. In an era without telecommunications, physically arriving in a region with a camp of 100,000 people allowed the central authority to project immense power locally.
It's the flex.
A massive flex. It allowed the emperor to personally oversee military campaigns on the frontiers, or even just to relocate because a region had suffered a drought and it was economically marginal to keep the massive court there. It was a visible reminder of who was in charge.
It is wild to visualize. A creeping, moving city of bureaucracy. But it clearly worked, because when you combine that level of centralized control with a stable, pure currency and a cash-driven agricultural sector relentlessly focused on high-value crops, you were essentially laying down the perfect kindling for an industrial fire.
Oh, absolutely.
Which brings us to the actual economic output of this machine. We have to talk about the proto-industrial juggernaut.
The numbers from these historical records are simply staggering, and they challenge everything we are traditionally taught about the history of industry.
Hit me with the numbers.
Up until the year 1750, India was producing an estimated 24.5% of the world's manufacturing output.
A quarter of everything manufactured on the globe. And they achieved this with what the historians in the sources describe as a surprisingly laissez-faire approach to trade.
Yeah, that's a key point.
We usually think of empires as micromanagers, heavily taxing every cart that moves. But the Mughals took a different approach. They didn't micromanage the merchants. They focused on infrastructure. They built an extensive empire-wide road network, set up a dedicated public works department to maintain it, and essentially let the market do its thing.
They understood that trade velocity equals tax revenue. The easier it is for goods to move, the more silver flows into the mints.
Right.
And the structure of their labor force reflects this massive economic engine. In the late 16th century, the primary sector, which is agriculture and raw material extraction, employed about 52% of the workforce. But the secondary sector, manufacturing, artisanal work processing, was sitting at 18%.
And to really understand how impressive that is, you have to look at the comparative data. The sources point out that an 18% workforce in manufacturing is actually higher than the percentage in early 20th century British India, which was sitting at around 11%.
That's a stunning comparison.
So hundreds of years earlier, under the Mughals, you had a significantly more industrialized workforce than under the British Empire later on.
Which is why economic historians refer to this specific era under the Mughals as proto-industrialization. It shares many characteristics with 18th century Western Europe right before the steam-powered Industrial Revolution took off.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the technological innovations driving this Mughal boom were incredibly significant, particularly in textiles.
Right. The textile industry was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the empire's economy.
And it was supercharged by a couple of key mechanical integrations that seem small but have massive implications. You had the widespread diffusion of the spinning wheel, which drastically lowered the cost of producing yarn. But more importantly, you had the incorporation of the worm gear and the crank handle into the roller cotton gin.
Okay, I want to break that down because it sounds like a minor mechanical tweak. But adding a crank handle and a worm gear to a cotton gin basically means you are transitioning from a slow, direct pull manual action to a continuous geared rotational force.
Exactly.
It means a single worker can process raw cotton, separating the seeds from the fiber exponentially faster and with less fatigue.
It creates a bottleneck breakthrough. You can process raw material faster, which means you can spin yarn faster, which means you can weave cloth faster. And the epicenter of all this wealth, the crown jewel of the empire's economy, was the Bengal Suba in the east.
Ah, Bengal. Reading through the records, Bengal in the 17th century feels like a modern economic miracle. I'd compare it to taking modern-day Silicon Valley in terms of rapid technological innovation with textile machinery and smashing it together with Shenzhen in China in terms of pure, massive, undisputed manufacturing scale.
That is a very apt modern way to visualize it. Bengal was unquestionably the wealthiest province in the empire. It had an incredibly fertile delta.
So they were feeding everyone, too.
Right. Domestically, it was the breadbasket, feeding massive portions of the subcontinent with rice. But internationally, it was an export monster. It was exporting staggering quantities of cotton textiles, like fine muslin and calico, along with massive shipments of silks and opium. Europe, frankly, became increasingly addicted to Bengali products.
And to move millions of yards of calico and tons of opium, you need ships. The shipbuilding data for Bengal blew my mind. The records estimate that the shipbuilding output of Bengal alone during the 16th and 17th centuries was 223,250 tons annually.
Numbers like that can wash over you without context.
Exactly. So let's contextualize it.
To give that 223,000 tons real meaning, if you take the shipbuilding output of all 19 North American colonies combined, during the period from 1769 to 1771, so right before the American Revolution when they were a maritime hub, it was only 23,061 tons.
So one Mughal province, Bengal, is producing roughly 10 times the shipping tonnage of the entire pre-revolutionary North American seaboard.
It was a true, undisputed global hub of maritime manufacturing. And because they exported so much more than they imported, because the world desperately wanted their spices, their textiles, their saltpeter for gunpowder, this created a massive trade imbalance in India's favor.
Everyone owed them money.
Global demand for their goods drew a steady, overwhelming stream of precious metals, specifically silver bullion, into the empire from Europe and the Americas. The Mughals didn't need to mine much gold or silver themselves. The rest of the world practically shipped it to them in exchange for cotton and pepper.
Which flows straight into the imperial mints, gets stamped into 96% pure silver rupees, and fuels the Zapit tax system we talked about earlier. It is a perfect, self-sustaining, closed-loop economic engine.
A very well-oiled machine.
But an engine of that magnitude requires a massive amount of human capital. You need bodies,
You need skilled hands to run the crank handles on the cotton gins, you need timber rights to build those thousands of ships, and you need laborers to farm the cash crops.
Which seamlessly transitions us into the demographic realities of the Mughal era. You cannot have that level of economic output without unprecedented population growth. Between the years 1500 and 1700, the population of the Indian subcontinent surged from roughly 100 million to 158.4 million.
That is nearly a 60% boost in population over 2 centuries. And they weren't just spreading out into new rural farming villages. The data shows the urbanization rate hit 15%.
And again, we have to contextualize that 15% figure. It means a significantly higher percentage of the population was living, working, and consuming in dense urban cities in Mughal India than in contemporary Europe at the exact same time. Europe as a whole didn't hit a 15% urbanization rate until well into the 19th century.
And these Mughal cities weren't just large provincial towns. These were true megacities by the standards of the era. Agra had a population of around 800,000. Lahore had 700,000. Dhaka, which was the capital of that hyper-wealthy Bengal province we just discussed, had well over 1 million people living in it.
These cities were incredibly dynamic, chaotic, brilliant hubs of human activity. They acted as massive consumer markets, but they were also the centers of production. They were home to the karkhanas.
The craft workshops.
Yes, these were organized, state-run, and privately run workshops. They weren't just single artisans working in a hut. These were large-scale facilities producing everything from heavy artillery and matchlocks to luxury silk textiles, intricate jewelry, and massive room-sized carpets for the imperial court.
Wow.
The level of artisanal specialization and division of labor within these karkhanas was breathtaking.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because when you have that much concentrated wealth, and you have highly specialized generational artisan classes constantly trying to outdo each other, you get scientific marvels that defy logic. We absolutely have to talk about the seamless, hollow celestial globe.
Ah, yes. One of the great metallurgical mysteries of the era. Invented in Kashmir by a metallurgist named Ali Kashmiri ibn Luqman in the late 16th century.
I read the notes on this, and it is fascinating. So modern metallurgists, up until these Mughal globes were physically rediscovered and analyzed in the 1980s, believed it was technically physically impossible to cast a hollow metal globe without any seams, using the traditional lost wax casting method.
Right, it shouldn't be possible.
The physics of the molten metal and the inner core just shouldn't allow it. It shouldn't exist. But these Mughal artisans in the karkhanas figured it out, and they didn't just do it once as a fluke. They produced over 20 of them.
It is a profound testament to the bleeding-edge mastery of metallurgy during the era. They were manipulating alloys and casting techniques that baffled 20th century scientists.
It's just wild.
And the intellect driving this wasn't limited to metallurgy. It extended deep into astronomy as well. The empire fostered a fascinating intellectual synthesis. During the 17th century, you saw a merging of traditional Islamic observational instruments, like the astrolabe, with highly advanced Hindu computational mathematics.
That's a cool crossover.
Yeah, a synthesis that was particularly championed later by the Hindu king Jaisingh II.
It is a melting pot of intellect. And it wasn't just Hindus and Muslims. The records even note the presence of a notable Jewish diaspora within the empire, heavily engaged in the high-end trade of gems and jewelry.
It was incredibly cosmopolitan.
You have this massive, diverse urban population rubbing shoulders in these mega cities. But I think we have to pause the celebration for a second and ask the critical economic question. What was the actual standard of living for the average person? Was the guy pulling the crank on the cotton gin actually benefiting from this massive proto-industrial boom?
That is where the historical data requires us to inject some serious nuance. On a macro level, the statistics look great. The per capita income, which historians often measure in terms of wheat purchasing power, how much bread your daily wage can buy, was actually higher in the late 16th century Mughal era than it would be centuries later in the early 20th century under British colonial rule.
So, objectively speaking, the average worker had more baseline purchasing power for basic sustenance than their great-great-grandchildren would have under the British.
Yes, that is empirically true based on the data. However, the internal distribution of that wealth was profoundly unequal. The Mughal system was built on a massive concentration of wealth at the very top.
The 1%.
More like the 0.1%. The elites, the high-ranking nobles, the emirs, the imperial court itself hoarded an astonishing percentage of the empire's GDP. And because of this massive hoarding of wealth and resources by the top tier, Wages for manual labor were actively systemically depressed.
Yeah.
You had immense macroeconomic prosperity, a boom in GDP, but the wealth gap between the emperor and the weaver was astronomical.
Right. The guy in Bengal building the ship isn't the one keeping the European silver bullion. Still, when you pack that many diverse people, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Jewish merchants, Persian engineers, Turkish cavalrymen into booming megacities with intense wealth inequality, you need a powerful, cohesive culture and a strict legal framework to keep it all from tearing itself apart. How do you unify that?
That is the great challenge of empire. And it brings us to their cultural amalgamation and their approach to the rule of law. The early Mughal emperors were acutely aware of their precarious position.
Because they were outsiders originally.
Exactly. They were a Muslim, Turco-Mongol minority ruling over a vast, incredibly diverse non-Muslim majority subcontinent. They couldn't rely on brute force alone forever. Their solution was to purposely cultivate and sponsor an overarching Indo-Persian political culture.
Right. The sources note that Persian became the absolute official language of the court, the administration, and the massive bureaucracy.
It was heavily institutionalized. If you wanted a job as a clerk in the Diwan, you learned Persian. It became nearly a first language for many inhabitants of Mughal India who were associated with the state.
Wow.
But the organic trickle-down effect of this is what's truly profound. The daily blending of high court Persian with old Hindi and local dialects in the bazaars, the army camps, and the administrative centers eventually led to the development of an entirely new language.
Hindustani.
Yes, Hindustani, and what we now formally know as Urdu.
The sources quote a contemporary poet saying, Urdu was the language of Hindustan by the authority of the king. The word Urdu itself literally means the language of the camp. It's fascinating how the gritty logistics of military camps and tax collection literally shapes the linguistics of millions of people. And this synthesis didn't stop at language. It bled into everyday life.
It permeated everything. You see it in the evolution of Mughlai cuisine, which is a masterful blending of native South Asian spices and cooking techniques with Iranian and Central Asian ingredients like nuts, dried fruits, and rich meats.
That sounds amazing, honestly.
It's delicious. You also see it in physical culture with the development of Pelwani wrestling, which synthesized ancient Indian martial arts with Persian physical conditioning exercises. And of course, most visibly, you see it in the monumental architecture.
The bulbous domes, the sweeping ogive arches, the striking contrast of native red sandstone with pristine white marble. The Taj Mahal is, of course, the ultimate globally recognized expression of this Indo-Islamic Persian synthesis.
The absolute peak of that aesthetic.
But beyond the tombs and the mosques, there are highly practical, almost unbelievable architectural and infrastructure marvels too. The records mention Emperor Shah Jahan establishing actual ice houses in the cities of Delhi and Sirmaur.
Let's think about the logistics of that for a second. Imagine the coordination involved in maintaining a functioning ice house in the sweltering, relentless heat of a Delhi summer in the 1600s.
It's crazy.
It required massive insulation techniques and a continuous supply chain of runners and boats bringing ice down from the Himalayas. It was the ultimate display of conspicuous consumption, but also a testament to their mastery of infrastructure.
But architecture, spicy food, and a common court language can only unite people so far. At the end of the day, if someone steals your horse or a merchant breaks a contract in the bazaar, you don't need a poem. You need the law. How did the Mughal legal system actually function on the ground?
The overarching legal framework was fundamentally based on Sunni Hanafi jurisprudence. To standardize this across the vast empire, they relied heavily on a massive legal compendium commissioned later by Emperor Aurangzeb called the Fatawa Alamgiri.
Okay, so a big law book.
But this wasn't just a copy-paste of Middle Eastern law. It was a monumental scholarly effort to adapt Islamic law to the specific, complex realities of the South Asian context, dealing with land rights, taxation, and trade.
And the men on the ground dispensing this law were the qadis, the judges?
Yes, there was a vast, sprawling hierarchy of qadis. You had them at the local village and district level, all the way up through the provincial courts, culminating in the Qadi Qudat, the chief judge of judges, who actually traveled with the mobile imperial camp alongside the emperor.
Right.
But it is crucial to understand that the system wasn't rigidly uniform in practice. It was highly context-specific.
What do you mean by context-specific? Does the law change depending on who you are?
In a way, yes. Dispensing justice in a diverse empire often involved a delicate balancing act. A local qadi had to weigh Islamic fiqh against deeply ingrained local Hindu village customs, caste rules, and frankly, political convenience.
So it wasn't one size fits all.
Not at all. They often acted more as mediators trying to find a socially acceptable resolution rather than rigid enforcers of a unified penal code.
But the records also point out a darker side to this local autonomy corruption. Corruption among local judges and tax collectors was a known systemic issue, which leads to one of the most vivid, almost theatrical images in the text Emperor Jahangir's Chain of Justice.
It is a striking image. Emperor Jahangir reportedly ordered the installation of a massive physical golden chain attached to a cluster of bells outside his residence at the Agra fort.
A golden chain.
Yes. The stated idea was that any aggrieved subject, regardless of their social status, who felt they were being wronged by corrupt local officials, could come to the fort, physically shake this chain, ring the bells, and bypass the entire bureaucracy to appeal directly to the emperor for justice.
Okay, I have to push back on this, because it sounds incredibly noble, like a fairy tale of the benevolent king. But was this just a massive PR stunt?
Well, let's look at it practically.
I mean, think about it in a modern context. Imagine installing a literal chain outside the White House or Buckingham Palace and expecting that a farmer from 1,000 miles away can just walk up, ring a bell, and the head of state's got to pop their head out the window and settle a local property dispute. That can't be how it actually worked.
You are right to be skeptical of its daily practicality. It was highly symbolic, certainly. The historical debate over whether it was used daily by commoners leans towards it being a powerful piece of royal propaganda.
Yeah, that makes more sense.
But its true historical value is what it represents. It perfectly encapsulates the core ideology of Mughal rule. The emperor was the supreme, unquestionable authority and the ultimate paternal arbiter of law. The entire system, the vast administration, the sprawling military, the complex courts, rested entirely, precariously, on the personal competence, energy, and authority of the single man sitting on the throne.
Which is, frankly, a terrifying single point of failure for an empire of 150 million people. If the guy at the top is a logistical genius, the empire thrives. If he's apathetic, or a zealot, or just incompetent, the whole machine grinds to a halt. Which brings us directly to the men who sat on that throne. We have to look at the emperor's paradox.
The transition of power from the 16th century through to the dawn of the 18th century showcases a dramatic, almost whiplash-inducing spectrum of rulership. We see a shift from radical syncretism to strict orthodoxy and ultimately to devastating imperial overstretch. Let's trace that arc because it explains the fall.
We have to start with Akbar. We've talked about him building the bureaucracy and the Zabit tax system.
Yeah.
But religiously and culturally, he was remarkably, surprisingly liberal for a 16th century conqueror.
Extremely liberal, Akbar actively allowed and encouraged freedom of religion at his court. He engaged in deep philosophical debates with Hindu Brahmins, Jesuit priests, and Zoroastrian scholars.
He just wanted to learn from everyone.
Yeah, he went so far as to completely abolish the jizya, which was the traditional Islamic tax levied on non-Muslim subjects. He even attempted to create an entirely new syncretic religion called Din-i-Ilahi.
Which is fascinating.
It blended elements of Islam, Hinduism, and Zoroastrianism with a very strong characteristic of a ruler cult centered around his own persona. He was hyper-focused on integrating the diverse socio-political elements of his empire into a single loyal fabric.
And his approach works. He leaves behind an incredibly stable, wealthy, administratively sound state. Then his son, Jahangir, takes over. And Jahangir seems, well, less focused.
Jahangir's reign is much more complicated and problematic. The records explicitly note he was heavily addicted to opium and alcohol, and he frequently neglected the daily grinding affairs of state.
That's a recipe for disaster.
It was. This apathy allowed rival court cliques, particularly those surrounding his wife, to gain massive influence and fracture the court's unity. He also began to reverse some of Akbar's deliberate distance from the orthodox Islamic religious establishment, granting more tax-free lands and power to conservative religious scholars.
And he also ignites a massive, deadly conflict with non-Muslim leaders. Specifically, he orders the execution of the Sikh guru Arjan. And that single act marks the beginning of a long, bloody, generational conflict between the Mughal state and the increasingly militarized Sikh community.
It was a disastrous political move. Following Jahangir, we get Shah Jahan. Now, this is the era of maximum visual splendor. This is the postcard era.
Right, the builder.
He builds the Taj Mahal, the massive red fort in Delhi, the Jama Masjid. It is the absolute zenith of Mughal architecture and cultural patronage.
But all that pristine white marble and intricately carved red sandstone isn't cheap.
Exactly the opposite. The staggering cost of maintaining the opulent court and funding these massive, relentless building projects began to severely exceed the massive revenues coming in from the Zabat system.
He's spending more than they're making.
He was bleeding the treasury dry for aesthetics, and his reign ends tragically. He falls seriously ill. A vicious war of succession breaks out among his sons while he is still alive, and the victor of that war, his son Aurangzeb, imprisons Shah Jahan in the Agra fort for the rest of his life, where he can only gaze out at the Taj Mahal he built.
Which brings us to Aurangzeb, arguably the most complex, fiercely debated figure in this entire 300-year history. Under Aurangzeb, the empire reaches its absolute maximum territorial extent. He pushes the borders to their absolute limit. But the internal policies shift radically.
Aurangzeb oversaw a distinct aggressive increase in the Islamicization of the state apparatus. He controversially reinstated the jizya tax on non-Muslims, reversing Akbar's policy. He executed the 9th Sikh guru, Tegh Bahadur, which led to the total formal militarization of the Sikh community into the Khalsa.
So he's cracking down hard.
For a very long time, classical historiography painted him in black and white. He was viewed purely as an intolerant religious zealot whose bigotry alienated his subjects and single-handedly doomed the empire.
But the records we are looking at provide a crucial counter-narrative, right? The historical reality, according to the data, is much grayer than just evil zealot. I want to push on this because it seems contradictory.
It is contradictory, and that's what makes it fascinating. We have to look at the actual bureaucratic records. The sources explicitly note that despite reinstating the jizya and destroying certain temples, Aurangzeb actually employed significantly more Hindus in his imperial bureaucracy and military command structure than any of his liberal predecessors, including Akbar.
Wait, really? More Hindus?
Yes. He also actively financed and patronized the building and maintenance of non-Muslim institutions alongside destroying others.
Wait, how does that square with him executing a Sikh guru and reinstating a religious tax? Was he a pragmatist or a zealot? You can't just be both on alternating Tuesdays.
It makes sense if you view it purely through the lens of cold, hard imperial power rather than pure theology. His actions were often based on ruthless political expediency.
Ah, so strategic.
Exactly. If a Hindu Rajput noble was loyal and useful, he was promoted to the highest ranks. If a temple was associated with a rebellious faction, it was destroyed. From the imperial perspective, integrating local elites, sometimes through forced conversion, but very often through lucrative employment, was entirely about maintaining absolute obedience to the throne.
So what does this all mean? If Aurangzeb wasn't just blindly, irrationally destroying the state through pure religious intolerance, if he was still employing Hindus and running the bureaucracy, why does the empire begin to fracture so badly during his specific reign? What is the actual structural failure?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the root of the catastrophic decline wasn't solely his religious ideology, though that caused immense friction. The fatal flaw was imperial overstretch.
Overstretch, right.
Aurangzeb spent the last several decades of his life engaged in ruinous, unrelenting, prolonged wars in the Deccan Plateau in the south of India, trying to conquer the Marathas and the remaining southern sultanates.
The endless frontier wars. History's absolute classic empire killer. You see it in Rome, you see it everywhere.
Precisely. I mean, it is the textbook definition of a strategic quagmire. These Deccan campaigns were a massive black hole for the Mughal treasury. They drained the finances accumulated over a century.
Decades of war will do that.
Furthermore, because the system relied entirely on the emperor, Aurangzeb's continuous, decades-long absence from the traditional capital in the north led to a severe, unchecked decline in central governance. The cats were away, and the mice began to carve out their own fiefdoms.
So the center just falls apart while he's fighting in the south.
He won the physical territory in the south, but he utterly exhausted the state's capacity to govern it.
He dies an old man, and he leaves behind an empire that is historically massive on a map, but fundamentally broke, politically exhausted, and managed by a layer of nobles who are starting to realize that the central authority, the eye of the emperor, is slipping. Which plunges us directly into Section 7, the unraveling and the fall.
The speed of the collapse is what truly shocks historians. You have an empire that took nearly 2 centuries to build to its peak. Aurangzeb dies in 1707. Within slightly over a single decade, By 1720, the essential functional structure of the centralized state was disintegrated beyond repair.
A decade. That is a blink of an eye historically.
Yes.
The records show a chaotic succession of weak, short-lived rulers. Civil wars constantly erupting over the throne. At one point, the chaos is so deep that 4 different emperors ascend the throne in a single year, 1719.
And they were ascending the throne because they were merely figureheads. Real power had completely shifted away from the emperor and into the hands of rival factions of high nobles at the court.
The kingmakers.
Yes. The most famous of these were the Sayyid brothers, who acted as the absolute de facto sovereigns. They were literally making, imprisoning, blinding, and unmaking emperors at will to suit their political needs.
I was thinking about how to visualize this collapse. And I keep coming back to a modern corporate analogy. It's like a massive global corporate bankruptcy. When a Fortune 500 company fails, it usually isn't because a tiny rival launched a hostile takeover out of nowhere. It fails from the inside.
Exactly.
It fails because of a sudden cash flow crisis, a brutal succession battle at the CEO level that distracts everyone, and then middle management out in the regional branches realizing no one is watching, so they decide to go rogue and start stealing the inventory.
I think we can take that corporate analogy even further. Aurangzeb's endless wars in the Deccan were basically a series of catastrophic corporate acquisitions that drained all the company's liquid cash.
Oh, that's spot on.
In fiscal terms, the Mughal throne simply lost the revenues needed to pay its chief officers, the emirs. The Zabit system broke down because the center couldn't enforce it. And because the emperor couldn't pay them, these widely scattered imperial officers who commanded the armies lost confidence in the central government.
If the checks bounce, you stop taking orders from headquarters.
Exactly. So these governors started making their own localized deals with regional men of influence. Powerful regional governors in extremely wealthy places like Awadh, Hyderabad, and crucially, Bengal, began to quietly break away.
They just started their own companies, basically.
They formed what were essentially independent, self-sustaining kingdoms. They still paid lip service to the Mughal emperor, maybe minted a coin in his name to maintain a veneer of legitimacy, but the tax revenues stopped flowing to Delhi.
And the military, which was bogged down for decades in the mud of the Deccan, fighting guerrilla wars against the Marathas, loses its invincible fighting spirit. The wagon fortresses and the matchlocks don't matter if the soldiers aren't being paid. And then, once the internal rot has hollowed out the tree, the external blows start landing.
In 1739, a devastating blow lands. Nader Shah, the ruler of Iran, invades India and completely sacks the city of Delhi.
Just kicks the doors in.
This single event shattered whatever lingering aura of prestige and invincibility the Mughals had left. Nader Shah's army massacred the citizens and completely emptied the accumulated Mughal treasury. He literally packed up the wealth that had fueled the empire for 2 centuries, the gold, the jewels, the silver, and took it back to Persia.
Including the famous peacock throne, which was the ultimate physical symbol of Mughal power. Imagine the psychological devastation of watching a foreign army dismantle your emperor's legendary throne and carry it out of the city gates.
It was an absolute humiliation.
After that 1739 sack, it's just a long, agonizing, slow bleed. The Marathas, the very people Aurangzeb spent his life trying to crush, expand rapidly, and actually become the official protectors of the powerless Mughal emperor in Delhi. But we have to address the elephant in the room. What about the Europeans, the British East India Company? Because the popular narrative is that the British showed up and conquered the Mughals.
That narrative is completely backward, and the sources make this very clear. The seemingly innocuous European trading companies played virtually no real part in the initial fatal decline of the empire.
Really? They were just watching.
Pretty much. During that rapid collapse between 1707 and 1720, the British and the Dutch were still essentially just groveling merchants, racing to get permission and firmans from Mughal rulers to establish tiny coastal trading posts. They did not cause the rot.
They were vultures, not the assassins.
That is the perfect distinction. They simply took advantage of the massive political and military vacuum that the internal rot created. As the empire fractured into regional powers, the East India Company began playing those regional powers against each other, utilizing their own modernizing military tech in deep pockets.
Eventually, the British East India Company grows so powerful that they replace the Marathas as the protectors of the dynasty. They keep the Mughal emperor around as a glorified pensioner, a puppet, and it finally officially ends in 1857. Following the massive Indian rebellion against British rule, the British decide the charade is over. They arrest the very last nominal Mughal emperor, an elderly poet named Bahadur Shah Zafar, put him on trial for treason, and exile him to Burma.
dissolving with the stroke of a pen an empire that had dominated the demographics, the economy, and the culture of the subcontinent for over 3 centuries.
It is a breathtaking, almost exhausting trajectory. We started with Babur's cannons and matchlocks devastating war elephants at Panipat. We traced the rise of Akbar's brilliant bureaucratic machine and the Zab tax system that monetized an entire subcontinent.
Yeah, a massive journey.
We saw the absolute proto-industrial dominance of Bengal, churning out thousands of ships and mountains of textiles that the royal courts of Europe desperately craved. We explored the cultural zeniths, the mind-bending metallurgy of the celestial globes, the creation of the Urdu language, the Taj Mahal, and then we watched the swift, brutal bureaucratic collapse driven by fiscal mismanagement, aristocratic infighting, and endless, exhausting frontier wars.
It is a history that demands reflection, primarily because it reminds us that human progress is never a continuous, uninterrupted upward trajectory. Think deeply about the demographic and economic realities we discussed earlier.
Yeah, those numbers really stick with you.
The cold, hard fact that a citizen living in British India in the late 19th century was actually living in a less urbanized, less industrialized, and comparatively poorer society than their Mughal ancestor was in the year 1700. That is a profound, deeply unsettling realization about the fragility of human civilization and complex economic systems. Progress can, and often is, undone.
It is entirely possible for an entire society to go backward, to lose the technology and the wealth they once possessed.
This raises an important question about the nature of power, centralization, and arrogance itself.
Exactly. And that is what I want to leave you, the listener, with today. Something to chew on long after this deep dive ends. Think about the mechanics of what we just unpacked. Here was an empire that, at its height, controlled 25% of the entire world's wealth. It featured an unmatched, globally dominant manufacturing scale. It possessed bleeding-edge military tech and scientific knowledge that baffled later generations.
It really had it all.
And yet, despite all of that immense structural power, it collapsed in just a few short decades. And it wasn't conquered from the outside. It collapsed entirely due to internal fiscal mismanagement, imperial overstretch at endless wars, and bitter, self-serving political polarization among its elite factions. When you look around at the hyper-centralized, massive economic superpowers of our modern world today nations that project power globally and control massive shares of the world's wealth, what lessons should they be taking away from the ghost of Hindustan? Because history rarely repeats itself, but it certainly rhymes.
A very sobering thought to end on.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the archives. Keep questioning the postcards, and we'll catch you next time.